Okay, so I'm going to continue with the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, kind of different introductory, secondary texts that are very helpful in introducing his work. This book I read a while ago when I was first getting into his work. It's called Spinoza Contra Phenomenology. It's by Knox Pedan, French Rationalism, from Cavalier to Deleuze. There's a chapter in here entitled Toward a Science of the Singular, Gilles Deleuze between Heidegger and Spinoza. And I'm going to go ahead and read from it as it gives you a good intro, not as abstract as kind of in the midst of Deleuze as Manuel de Landa is with his work. This gives you kind of a more broad overview. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. Chapter 6 is Toward a Science of the Singular. Again, Gilles Deleuze between Heidegger and Spinoza. Quote from Gilles Deleuze from Difference and Repetition. All that Spinozaism needed to make the univocal an object of pure affirmation was to make substance turn around the modes. So here we go. Among the major thinkers of the 20th century French philosophy, few had as wide a field of interest as Gilles Deleuze. The diversity of objects that garnered Deleuze's attention, from the writings of Leopold von Sacher-Masoch to the paintings of Francis Bacon, is exceeded only by the diversity of intellectual resources called upon to develop his thinking in the first place. Aside from the canonical thinkers covered in his monographs of the 1950s and 60s, Deleuze's philosophical writings refer to a set of themes and writers that can seem affected in its eclecticism and willful in its obscurantism. For example, his major philosophical statement, Difference and Repetition, 1968, which was his thesis, takes us from the occultism of Joseph Marie Juan Vronsky's post-Kantian consideration of differential calculus to the biophysical Gnosticism of one of Deleuze's contemporaries, Raymond Rouyer. These figures are joined by a cast of characters that is alternately ancient, medieval, and modern. The preface to The Logic of Sense is titled From Lewis Carroll to the Stoics. Deleuze's idiosyncrasy is often taken for granted in general assessments of recent French thought. In order to acquire some purchase on the sources of his complex project, as well as its fundamental arguments and concerns, let us begin with considering the impact of two proximate influences on Deleuze, who are familiar faces on our account: Ferdinand Alquier and Martial Girault. So this book has several different essays. It's written in essay form, so it's probably referencing some authors that they referenced prior to this essay here. On January 28, 1967, Deleuze delivered a lecture in the Société Française de Philosophie titled, quote, The Method of Dramatization, end quote. Keeping with a long-standing tradition in French academia, the event provided him the opportunity to publicly share a condensed version of his doctoral work with his peers. Alquier was in the audience along with Marcel de Candelac, Jean Befrat, and Alexis Filonieko, among others. Most of the material Deleuze presented was culled from the fourth and fifth chapters of Difference and Repetition, the work to be submitted as his major doctoral thesis several months later. Those are the best chapters, by the way. Beginning as an excursus on philosophical methodology, arguing for questions of who and how to replace those of what, the bulk of the talk explicated his conception of the relation of the virtual to the actual as an equally ontological and epistemological phenomenon. Deleuze emphasized the role of spatio-temporal dynamic processes in generating both new concepts and new physical entities. Revising Kant's account of the relation of the ideas to concepts, Deleuze insisted that the play of ideas takes place on a virtual plane and that concepts serve as their actualization. In themselves, ideas qua ideas are virtual multiplicities analogous to the multiplicity inherent in all being. Like sensations, they are virtual since they evade empirical verification, and multiple since they express change. The common denominator is intensity. Quote, though experience always puts us in the presence of intensities already developed and extensions already covered over with qualities we must conceive precisely as a condition of experience, pure intensities veiled in a depth in an intensive spatum that pre-exist all quality and all extension. In this instance, Deleuze's spatium, spatium, plays a role not unlike Kant's sensorium, as the domain in which all intellection and sensation take place, thereby serving as a common frame for the material and the ideal. Shortly after the conclusion of Deleuze's talk, Alcuí pressed his student on a number of key points. Alcuí was the main reader of Deleuze's minor thesis, Spinoza and the Problem of Expression, and the two had a relationship that went back to Deleuze's days as a student at the Sorbonne in the late 1940s. Alcuí effectively charged Deleuze with not doing philosophy, with evading its most fundamental questions. Though he expressed sympathy for Deleuze's contention that philosophy needed to concern itself with problems, he was chagrined that none of Deleuze's examples were themselves philosophical. Quote, "He has spoken to us about the straight line, which is a mathematical example, about the egg, which is a physiological example, about genes, which are biological example. When he got to truth, I said, finally, here is a philosophical example. But this example quickly went astray, for Deleuze told us we must ask ourselves, who wants truth? Why does one want truth? Is the one who wants truth jealous? Etc. No doubt very interesting questions, but they don't touch on the very essence of truth. So perhaps they are not strictly philosophical questions." End quote. Deleuze's response to Alcuí is illuminating, even if we make allowances for the element of academic propriety that is in play. After clarifying the way questions of what can often mask more urgent questions of how, for example, Kant's question of what is an object is secondary to how is an object possible. Deleuze tells Alcuí, quote, Your other criticism concerns me even more, for I believe entirely in philosophy's specificity, and, in fact, I get this conviction from you." End quote. To elaborate this point, Deleuze reaffirms the irreducibility of the idea to any of its actualizations, making the case for philosophy as a practice ultimately concerned with a specific object, the idea, conceived as a virtual multiplicity inexhaustible in its riches. As we saw in Chapter 2, for Alcuí, philosophy was a practice that, while unable to grant unmediated access, nonetheless provided the intuition of an ineffable beyond or excess of being, irreducible to the here and now of the world as it is presented to us. The titles of Alcuí's books tell us the story of La nostalgia de l'être, le désir de l'éternité. For Alcuí, any philosophy that sought to capture or fully express his excess was a philosophy in bad faith. On this score, Deleuze was not speaking in bad faith himself when he averred that he got this notion from Alcuí. Indeed, he had concluded his talk with the following pronouncement, quote, "The clear and distinct is the claim of the concept of the Apollonian world of representation. But beneath representation, there is always the idea and its distinct obscure ground, a drama beneath all logos." End quote. Employing Nietzschean terms, Deleuze put forward a thesis nonetheless consistent with Alcuí's own in La déconvoir métaphysique de l'homme chez Descartes. Subtending the clear and distinct idea is an obscure ground, a drama that is never concluded or exhausted by its fleeting capture to the clear and distinct. This seems to be the sense of the virtual actual relation as it is presented in this talk. The realm of the virtual is always in excess of its actualization. Yet this notion of ideas as an excess of their conceptual expression squares awkwardly with arguments Deleuze put forward the next year in one of the most glowing reviews of his career, Spinoza and the General Method of M. Girault. Girault's book, Deleuze argued, founded the truly scientific study of Spinozism. It possessed a double importance. As at once a study of Spinoza's ethics and a culmination of Girault's own rationalist methodology in the history of philosophy, the engagement with Spinozism was not simply one application of this method among others. Following up on previous studies of Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz, Spinozism was where Girault's method found its most adequate, most saturated, and most exhaustive object. By all appearances, Deleuze endorsed Girault's insistence on the nature of the understanding of Spinozism, and Spinozism was most radical thesis, absolute rationalism, founded on the adequation of our understanding to absolute knowledge. Absolute rationalism, imposing the total intelligibility of God, the key of the total intelligibility of things, is thus for Spinozism the first article of faith. The similarities between Girault's account of Spinoza's philosophy and the one Deleuze published the same year are striking and illuminating. The most important of these shared positions is the insistence that the first 8 propositions of the ethics, which makes the case for the substantiality of the attributes, do not serve as a mere heuristic to affirm the logical impossibility of more than one substance, but are instead to be read as genetic components integral to the construction of a metaphysics in which the attributes thought and extension are really distinct. The point is technical but important. What Deleuze and Girault agree on is the real substantial distinction of thought and extension, meaning that these two attributes are not mere categories of the understanding in a Kantian sense. They are and must be ontologically distinct. It is their distinction that allows them to relate without being reducible to or subsumed within one another. This distinction is the linchpin of Girault's own effort to read the process common to Spinoza's concept of substance and the philosophical method that results as one that is genetic, in other words, synthetic. We can translate this formula into ontological, in other words, epistemological, and lose little of its sense. For the claim is that the ontological process of genesis and the epistemological process of synthesis are, from a philosophical point of view, always formally the same process. There is no transcendental subject or operator that enacts the synthesis needed to constitute discrete beings. Deleuze's problem with Kant is the same as Girault's. The synthetic components of the transcendental unity of a perception are posited without being ontologically explained, that is, without having their own genesis accounted for. Spinoza gives us an absolute rationalism because he unifies epistemology and ontology, synthesis and genesis. The principle of sufficient reason knows no limits, including its own genesis as a principle within the immanent terms of Spinoza's philosophy. If anything, this system, with its insistence upon absolute intelligibility, countenances no notion of excess. The impossibility of excess in being is the flip side of Spinoza's insistence that substance knows no privation. How does this square with Deleuze's claim in the method of dramatization for the idea as a virtual multiplicity that is forever distinct, obscure, and inexhaustible in its actualization? At this stage, it seems that Deleuze was sincere in his claim that the purpose of philosophy is to produce problems, and insoluble ones at that. The point of revisiting the Girault-Alquier differend that was mapped in Chapter 2 is to emphasize its constitutive presence in Deleuze's own thought, and to use it as a point of entry into what arguably the guiding tension in a historical and philosophical sense of his enterprise, that between Spinozist rationalism, that affirms absolute intelligibility, and the Heideggerian phenomenological existentialism that emphasizes movement and disjuncture, and imputes a philosophical value to the obscure. On this score, Deleuze's affirmation of Girault's project is no isolated accident. Peers have indicated how much Deleuze's thinking about method in the history of philosophy was shaped by Girault's example. As we will see further on, Girault's study of Salomon Maimon was one of Deleuze's key references throughout his works, as was Julius Vullmann's study of the Kantian legacy, a book dedicated to Girault and that anticipates many of Deleuze's own concerns. The influence of Girault or Giraultian school on Deleuze's thinking manifests itself an uncompromising commitment to rationalism and an affinity for Spinozism. But if Girault's role in Deleuze's thought provides us any way into the latter Spinozism, what of Alquier's influence? Though it is presented as a comical aside, we should recall Jacques Derrida's comment in his interview with Dominique Jancoire that Alquier always felt that Heidegger had stolen his philosophical idea. As a Sorbonne professor, Alcuin served as something of an institutionally domesticated surrogate for Heidegger's influence in France, in that his readings of the metaphysicians of early modern philosophy by and large squared with the existential pathos of Heidegger's critique of metaphysics. As noted, Alcuin was a formative influence on the generation of French thinkers that Jean-Claude deemed illustrative of the theological turn in French phenomenology. Chief among them, Michel Henry and Jean-Luc Mayron. One of Deleuze's most assiduous students and readers, Eric Aliès, has suggested that Deleuzean philosophy is itself a critical reflection of the impossibility of phenomenology. That is, the conviction that phenomenology cannot but lead to a negative theology in its interminable displacement of the sources of givenness. Against accounts of the phenomenological given, Deleuze professes a philosophy of transcendental empiricism, a hyper-rationalism that yields a philosophical account in which everything is produced within an immanent conception of being, and nothing is ever given from an inaccessible exteriority. Despite the recurrent presentation of this agenda as a rejection of phenomenology, Heidegger's philosophy, with its critical destruction of consciousness as an effect of more primordial modalities of being, was a fundamental condition of Deleuze's thought, and not merely in a negative sense. In recent years, philosophers have recognized the utility of considering Deleuze in relation to Heidegger. Shortly after Deleuze's death in 1995, Giorgio Agamben and Alain Badiou each published assessments that emphasized the unexpected commonalities between the two thinkers. A sense of their related projects can be gained from the excerpts from the method of dramatization cited previously. Deleuze's emphasis on the question of who over what is one example. More suggestive still is Deleuze's claim that the existence of qualities, in extension, masks the intensive processes that generate them, a position that can be usefully compared with Heidegger's account of present at hand as grounded in a more primordial readiness to hand. There's much to be gained through speculative comparisons of Deleuze and Heidegger on a philosophical level. But the first aim here is historical, to account for the genesis of Deleuze's own thought and to argue for the underappreciated role of Heidegger's philosophy in it. Given the emphasis in the preceding chapters on Spinozism, resurgence as a critical response to phenomenology in France, it may seem odd that an assessment of Deleuze's Spinozism would be so concerned with his Heideggerianism. But this is precisely the point, for I intend to show the way in which Deleuze's engagement with Spinoza was initially shaped by a set of Heideggerian concerns, and how Deleuze's own thinking came to render each thinker unrecognizable in his refraction through the other, giving us a philosophy that could be alternately described as a rationalist Heideggerianism and an existentialist Spinozism. Deleuze's importance is clear from his placement in the terminal point of this inquiry. In terms of its broader aims, the argument is that French Spinozism is fundamentally transformed by Deleuze's work, and that the variant of Spinozism, that continues to inform much of contemporary political thought, often draws more on Heideggerian elements that Deleuze brings to Spinozism than on the formal, subtractive, in a word, rationalist elements of Spinozism, whose critical relation to phenomenology has been explored in the preceding chapters. The structure of the presentation is as follows. In the first chapter, I attempt to reconstruct the genesis of Deleuze's own thinking by showing how and why the desire to move beyond Heidegger resulted in recourse to Spinoza. This involves first showing the generally underappreciated importance of Heideggerian philosophy and its French variants in the gestation of Deleuze's project. Second, I argue that Deleuze's turn to Spinoza as a way to move beyond Heidegger's problematic was in fact sublimated or stimulated by the hostility to Heidegger's project evinced in the studies of post-Kantian philosophy produced by Girault and his student Julius Voluman, both of whom figure as prominent references throughout the first half of Deleuze's career. Finally, I attempt to show that Deleuze's doctoral work on Spinoza in effect reads Spinoza not simply as a post-Kantian but as a post-Heideggerian. This effort results in an involution of Heidegger's and Spinoza's philosophies that produces a kind of hybrid Heidegger-Spinoza that would have been unthinkable for Jean Cavalier. Marcel Giraud, or indeed Louis Althusser. It is this very involution of Heidegger and Spinoza whose consequence will be charted throughout the following chapter, which is a reading of Deleuze's most significant philosophical works, Difference in Repetition and Logic of Sense. The aim is to illuminate the way Deleuze's thinking moves between Heidegger and Spinoza and its own argumentative procedures. Deleuze is a notorious slippery thinker. His fondness for the figures of folds and the smooth spaces is of a piece with his most basic philosophical methodology. The sense of conceptual movement that results is one of the repetitive vacillation between Heideggerian and Spinozist positions that nonetheless moves forward in an increasingly robust critique of the predominant category of Heideggerian ontology in Deleuze's understanding, possibility. Moving through the figures of time, death, origins, negation, in each instance, Deleuze attempts to undermine these concepts. Ontological remit by showing them to be grounded in the category of the possible, a concept that is, in Deleuze's rationalist view, inapplicable to ontology. What Deleuze offers in place of the possible's relation to the real is the putatively more primordial relation of the virtual to the actual. A guiding concern will be how well Deleuze's renewed understanding of the virtual and the actual, mediated through Spinoza's rationalism, manages to transcend the Heideggerian problematic that is its ostensible target of critique. Following this reading of Deleuze's major works, I briefly considered Deleuze's post-1960s development to suggest that, even as he evinces an ever stronger commitment to Spinozism, his philosophy will not shake the constitutive dualism of the virtual-actual relation and its early depths to selective appropriation of Heidegger's ontological difference between being and beings. Yet I also submit that it is only in this later writings that Deleuze's most fundamental conviction, which is also his most fundamental debt to Spinoza, will acquire its greatest clarity: the primacy accorded to thought itself over any other mode of existence. All right, that's the introduction to this chapter. Let's see, the chapter is Good Sense. I haven't read this in a while, and I see some markings here. Maybe 40, 50 pages. So let me know what you think. Thanks for listening.